I helped my brother become a CEO, only for him to backstab me, steal my job, and leave me broke. Years later, I'm a millionaire, and he's living in a motel, begging me for help. So, here's the deal. My name's Jake, and I never thought I'd be the guy posting on here, but I need to get this off my chest. This story isn't just about me, though. It's about my brother, Brandon, and the kind of betrayal that makes soap operas look tame. A few years ago, I had my dream job. I was working as the VP of a major tech company, making insane money, finally feeling like I'd made it. Brandon, on the other hand, was my older brother who never really had his life together. He'd hop from job to job, always broke, always with some excuse for why nothing was his fault. We were close growing up, but by this point, he was the guy you only call on holidays to keep mom happy. Anyway, things were going great until our company announced the CEO was retiring, and they were looking for someone internal to take over. Everyone knew I was the frontrunner. I had the experience, the connections, and let's be real, I was the one keeping the place running. But then Brandon swoops in out of nowhere. He tells me he's been struggling lately and wants to turn his life around. Says he's got this big idea for a startup and just needs a little help. Of course, I couldn't say no. I mean, he's my brother. I let him crash at my place, lent him money, even helped him network with some of my connections. Turns out, helping him was the worst decision of my life. One day, I walk into the office, and the vibe is just off. My coworkers won't make eye contact, and my boss keeps avoiding me. Then I find out why. Brandon had been secretly meeting with the execs behind my back, feeding them lies about me. Stuff like how I'd been embezzling money, how I was planning to leave the company for a competitor. Absolute BS. Wanna know the kicker? He used everything I gave him, my connections, my advice, my trust, to steal the CEO's spot right out from under me. I was fired within a week. Brandon didn't even have the decency to tell me himself. I found out in the company-wide email announcing his promotion. But here's the thing about me, I don't stay down for long. What I did next is where things really start to get interesting. So, after I got fired, I was completely wrecked. My savings were decent, but with the lifestyle I'd been living, they wouldn't last forever. Meanwhile, Brandon was out there living my life, driving the company car, cashing in my stock options, and acting like he'd built that empire from scratch. I tried confronting him, of course. I showed up at his new fancy office one day, thinking maybe I could at least get some kind of explanation. But when I walked in, his assistant stopped me, saying, "Mr. Brandon is in an important meeting." Mr. Brandon? Are you kidding me? I knew this guy when he couldn't even afford a Domino's pizza without splitting it with me. When I finally got in to see him, he acted like I was the crazy one. He smirked, and said, "Jake, you were holding the company back. You're better off out of it. This is business." Business? I wanted to punch him right then and there, but instead, I walked out and decided to channel that anger into something productive. If he was going to play dirty, I'd play smarter. So I started over. I took every bit of knowledge I had from working in tech and started building my own thing. I worked insane hours, poured every penny I had into it, and slowly started to see results. At first, it was just enough to keep the lights on, but then one month, I landed a huge client. That's when everything changed. Fast forward a couple of years, and my business was pulling in over $1 million a month. I'd built something bigger than anything Brandon had ever touched, and I did it without screwing over my family. But here's the twist, I didn't forget what he did to me. One night, I'm scrolling through social media when I see this post from Brandon. It's a photo of him at a beach resort, drinking champagne, with the caption, "Haters gonna hate, but I'm living my best life." Typical Brandon garbage. But then I noticed something interesting in the comments. Apparently, things weren't as great as he was making them look. People were asking about delayed projects, missed deadlines, and layoffs at the company. One guy even commented, "Can't believe you sold out to investors. Totally ruined the company." Sold out? Now that caught my attention. I did some digging and found out that Brandon had sold a majority of the company to private investors, and they were running it into the ground. Turns out, my brother wasn't the business genius he pretended to be. He was just a guy who got lucky and couldn't keep his empire together. That's when I realized it was time to make my move. After I found out Brandon had sold the company, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was poetic, really. He screwed me over to get that job, and now the whole thing was circling the drain. But I didn't just want to sit back and watch him fail. I wanted to make sure he knew I was behind it. First, I had to figure out just how bad things were. Turns out, the investors he sold to weren't exactly known for running a tight ship. They were slashing costs left and right, outsourcing departments, and gutting the company culture. Morale was in the toilet, clients were jumping ship, and the stock price was tanking. It was a disaster. And Brandon? He was doing what he always does, pretending everything was fine while blaming everyone else for his problems. I found out he'd been lying to his employees about why the layoffs were happening, claiming it was necessary restructuring, when really, he'd burned through company cash on his own ridiculous lifestyle. Private jets, luxury watches, VIP tables at clubs, he went all out. So I started laying the groundwork for my plan. First, I reached out to a few former colleagues from the company who'd been laid off. These were people who had been loyal to me before Brandon came in and ruined everything. I gave them jobs at my business, better pay, better benefits, the works. It didn't take long for word to get around, and soon I had a steady stream of resumes from Brandon's sinking ship. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted Brandon to feel the burn personally. I knew he was all about appearances, so I started showing up at the same events he attended. Tech conferences, networking mixers, charity galas, you name it. Every time, I made sure to, accidentally, bump into him, always with a subtle flex. Brandon! Wow, long time no see. Things must be crazy for you right now, huh? I mean, I've been hearing a lot about the company lately. Tough market, right? I'd say it all with a smile, but the look on his face every time was priceless. And then came the real power move. One of the big clients Brandon's company had lost was a Fortune 500 giant I'll call Titan Corp. They were a whale account, worth millions annually, and when they bailed, it sent shockwaves through his company. I'd been quietly building a relationship with their team for months, and when the time was right, I pitched them on working with my business instead. They signed a deal with me within a week. The best part? Titan Corp was Brandon's last big client keeping his company afloat. When the news broke, the fallout was immediate, investors panicked, the stock plummeted even further, and layoffs turned into a full-blown shutdown. Brandon didn't just lose his job. He lost everything. And that's when I got the idea to pay him one last visit. The day I decided to visit Brandon, I made sure to do it right. I wasn't just going to show up unannounced. I wanted him to feel the weight of everything he'd lost and know exactly who was responsible. I found out he'd moved into a smaller house, which was a far cry from the massive estate he'd bought when he first became CEO. It was a nice enough place, but nothing compared to the image he always tried to project. The guy who used to flaunt private jets was now living in what looked like a slightly upgraded rental. When he opened the door, he looked terrible. His hair was a mess, he'd gained weight, and there was this air of desperation about him. For a moment, I almost felt bad, almost. But then he spoke. "Oh, it's you," he sneered. "What do you want, Jake? Here to gloat?" I gave him the most casual smile I could muster. "Gloat? Nah, just checking in. You know, brother to brother." He rolled his eyes and motioned for me to come in. His living room was a disaster, empty takeout containers, unopened bills scattered everywhere, and a laptop on the coffee table with a job search site open on the screen. The mighty Brandon, reduced to this. "So," I said, looking around, "how's life treating you?" "Cut the crap, Jake," he snapped. "I know you had something to do with this." I shrugged. "What can I say? Business is business, right? Isn't that what you told me when you stole my job?" That shut him up for a second. He just stared at me, his jaw tightening. "You don't get it," he finally said. "I had to do what I did. I deserved that position more than you ever did. You were always the golden boy, the favorite. I had to fight for everything I got." I couldn't help but laugh. "Fight for it? Brandon, you didn't fight for anything. You lied, you cheated, and you sold out the company to cover your ass. And look where it got you." He was fuming now, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Just because you've got money now? Newsflash, Jake, I'm still your older brother, and you wouldn't be where you are if it weren't for me." "Really?" I said, crossing my arms. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I built my success from scratch while you burned yours to the ground." He stopped pacing and glared at me, his face red with anger. "You came here just to rub it in, didn't you? You couldn't let me have anything. I leaned in closer, dropping my voice. You're right, Brandon. I did come here to rub it in. Because I want you to remember this moment every time you think about what you lost. And I want you to know it wasn't bad luck, or the market, or the investors. It was me. I took everything from you, just like you took everything from me. The silence that followed was deafening. He didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at me like he wanted to strangle me. And for the first time in years, I felt like I'd finally gotten the closure I needed. As I walked out the door, I turned back and said, "Oh, and Brandon? Good luck on the job hunt. You're gonna need it." But here's the thing, I wasn't quite done with him yet. I had one more card to play, and this one would change everything. Walking out of Brandon's house should have felt like the end of the story. I'd won. I'd built something bigger than he ever could, and I'd watched his entire world crumble. But the thing is, it still didn't feel like enough. I mean, he didn't even apologize, didn't admit what he did, didn't take any responsibility. He still saw himself as the victim. And that's when I decided I wasn't finished. You see, Brandon didn't just screw me over in business. He'd been a liar his entire life. Back when we were kids, he'd cheat in board games, steal my stuff, and somehow always convince our parents that I was the one causing problems. He was a master manipulator, and for years I let him get away with it. This time, I wanted to make sure everyone saw him for who he really was. First, I called a few mutual acquaintances, people we'd both worked with back in the day. I started dropping hints about what had really gone down when I was fired. Nothing too direct, just enough to make them curious. Did you ever wonder how Brandon managed to get that CEO position so quickly? I'd ask. Funny how all those rumors about me started right before he got promoted, huh? Word spread fast. People started piecing things together, and before long, Brandon's reputation was taking another hit. But that was just the appetizer. Next, I dug into his finances. Remember how I mentioned his lavish spending? Well, it turns out Brandon wasn't just reckless, he was also in debt. Big debt. Between his house, his cars, and his insane lifestyle, he'd been living way beyond his means for years. And since the company was gone, so was his cash flow. So, I did what any good little brother would do, I bought his debt. It wasn't hard. I had the money, and the banks were more than happy to offload his accounts to me. Overnight, I became the owner of every loan, credit line, and unpaid bill he had. And that's when I sent him the letter. The letter wasn't aggressive or threatening, it was polite, professional, almost cold. It simply stated that his debts had been transferred to a new lender, me, and that repayment terms were due to be renegotiated. I even included a payment plan option, knowing full well he couldn't afford it. A week later, my phone rang. "Jake, what the hell is this?" Brandon's voice was shaking, half angry, half desperate. "Oh, you got my letter," I said, playing dumb. "Yeah, I figured I'd take over your debts. I mean, families should help each other out, right?" "Help?" he snapped. "You call this help? You're trying to ruin me." "Ruin you?" I said, laughing. "Brandon, you did that all by yourself. I'm just holding you accountable. Isn't that what you used to say? Business is business?" He begged me to cut him some slack too. Work something out. But I wasn't having it. This was the guy who stole my career and never looked back, and now he wanted mercy. Not a chance. Still, I wasn't trying to destroy him completely. Not yet anyway. I had something much bigger in mind. Brandon called me 3 more times after that first conversation. Each time, he tried a different tactic. First, he begged, said he was in a tough spot and needed more time. Then, he got angry, accusing me of being vindictive and petty. By the 3rd call, he tried playing the family card. "Jake, come on," he said. "We're brothers. I know I screwed up, but this is too far. Just give me some room to breathe, and I swear I'll get back on my feet." That was classic Brandon. Always making promises he couldn't keep. I told him I'd think about it. Which really just meant I was working on my next move. See, the thing about Brandon is that his pride is everything to him. He's spent his whole life crafting this image of success, even if it's all smoke and mirrors. So I decided to go after the one thing he valued more than money, his reputation. I started with his social circle. Brandon loved being the center of attention, always bragging about how he was the smartest guy in the room. So I casually reached out to a few of his former friends and colleagues. Hey, did you hear about what happened with Brandon's company? I'd ask, pretending to be concerned. Yeah, it's such a shame. I heard he had to sell because he couldn't keep it running. And now he's in a bit of financial trouble. Crazy, right? The whispers spread like wildfire. By the time I was done, half the people he knew were talking about how he overreached and mismanaged his way into bankruptcy. The same people who used to kiss up to him at parties were now mocking him behind his back. Then I went after his professional reputation. I reached out to some of his old investors, the ones who'd bought into the company he tanked, and offered them an opportunity to partner with my business. I framed it as a way to recoup some of their losses from the mess Brandon left behind. Most of them jumped at the chance. But the best part? I made sure to include a little clause in our contracts, a non-compete agreement that explicitly barred them from ever working with Brandon again. He didn't just lose his connections, he lost his ability to rebuild. The final nail in the coffin came a month later. I threw a massive charity event for my company, the kind of thing that attracts CEOs, investors, and anyone who's anyone in the industry. It was a black tie affair, with all the glitz and glamour Brandon used to thrive on. And of course, I sent him an invitation. To my surprise, he actually showed up. He walked in wearing a suit that didn't quite fit right anymore, trying to put on that same smug air he used to have. But it was obvious to everyone that he didn't belong. People avoided him, whispered behind his back, and when he tried to strike up conversations, they gave him polite smiles before walking away. It was brutal. At one point, he cornered me near the bar. "You've made your point, Jake," he said, his voice low and bitter. "You've ruined my life. Happy now?" I just smiled and said, "Not quite. But I'm getting there." Brandon leaving that charity event early was the cherry on top of the night. He'd shown up trying to salvage whatever scraps of pride he had left, only to walk out humiliated. But here's the thing, I wasn't just trying to crush him. I wanted him to understand why this was happening. A week after the event, I sent him a package. It wasn't anything flashy, just a plain manila envelope. Inside I included a letter, a few photos, and copies of some of the contracts I'd signed with his old investors. The letter was short and to the point. "Brandon, this is what it feels like to lose everything because of someone you trusted. Enjoy the view from the bottom. Jake." The photos were from the charity event, candid shots of him standing alone while everyone else mingled and laughed. And the contracts? Well, let's just say they made it crystal clear that he'd burned every bridge he had left in the industry. I figured he'd blow up my phone after getting it, but instead, I didn't hear a word from him. For weeks, it was radio silence. No calls, no texts, nothing. At first, I thought he was just licking his wounds. But then I started to hear rumors. Apparently, Brandon had been going around claiming that I was sabotaging his life. True, that I'd stolen his investors. Also true, and that I was trying to destroy his family. Definitely not true. He was spinning this wild narrative to anyone who'd listen, painting himself as the victim and me as the villain. At first, I brushed it off. I mean, anyone who knew me, or him, could see through his lies. But then I found out he'd gone a step further. He'd started reaching out to journalists. I got a heads up from one of my PR contacts that Brandon was trying to sell some exclusive story about me being this ruthless, cutthroat businessman who used underhanded tactics to crush my competition. He even threw in some nonsense about how I'd always been jealous of him and was trying to rewrite history to make myself look good. That's when I knew I had to step up my game. I decided to get ahead of the story before Brandon could spin it his way. I reached out to a few trusted media contacts of my own and set up an interview. In it, I laid everything out, my career, how I built my business from scratch, and yes, how my own brother had betrayed me. I didn't hold back. The article went viral. People loved the underdog story of the guy who rose from nothing after being stabbed in the back by his own family. Brandon? He came off looking like a bitter, washed-up liar. After the piece dropped, he called me again. This time, he wasn't angry, he sounded scared. "You're destroying me, Jake," he said. "Do you even care? I'm your brother. Were you thinking about that when you lied to get me fired?" I shot back. "When you spread rumors and stole everything I worked for? Don't play the victim, Brandon. You're just mad because you finally ran out of people to blame." For a second, he didn't say anything. Then, in a low, shaky voice, he said, You don't know what you're doing. Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing, I replied. And I'm just getting started. After that phone call, I expected Brandon to try something desperate, but I underestimated just how far he was willing to go. It started small, little jabs on social media. He'd post cryptic messages like, "Funny how some people only succeed by stepping on others," or, "Family should be about love, not revenge." His few remaining followers would chime in with sympathy, clearly unaware of the full story. I ignored it at first, figuring he was just venting, but then things escalated. One day, I got an email from a reporter at a business blog. The subject line read, "Care to comment on these allegations?" My stomach dropped as I opened it, and saw a list of accusations Brandon had apparently fed them. He claimed I'd stolen trade secrets from his company to start my business, that I'd blackmailed investors, and even that I'd used illegal tactics to get him into debt. It was all garbage, of course, but the fact that he was trying to smear me publicly? That crossed the line. I called my lawyer immediately, and we drafted a response to the blog, shutting down every claim with hard evidence. The reporter backed off, but it was clear Brandon wasn't going to stop. He was like a drowning man, flailing and trying to take me down with him. So, I decided to pull the ultimate trump card. See, Brandon had always been obsessed with looking successful, but what most people didn't know was how much of his success was built on lies. Remember that lavish lifestyle he used to flaunt? The cars, the watches, the designer clothes? Well, I had receipts, literally. Years ago, when he was still CEO, he'd been using company funds to pay for his personal expenses. I'd kept copies of the financial reports, thinking they might come in handy someday. Now, I had the perfect opportunity to use them. I sent an anonymous tip to a respected investigative journalist, attaching the documents and explaining how Brandon had embezzled money to fund his lifestyle. I made sure to include specific dates, amounts, and even a few photos of his extravagant purchases. I wasn't just handing them a story, I was handing them a scandal. When the article dropped, it was brutal. The headline alone was enough to ruin him. Former CEO accused of misusing company funds for personal gain. It went viral within hours, and the fallout was immediate. People who'd been defending him online suddenly went silent. His remaining allies in the business world distanced themselves faster than you can say. Lawsuit. But the best part. The investors he'd sold the company to announced they were suing him for breach of contract. They accused him of misrepresenting the company's financial health during the sale, and with the evidence I'd provided, their case was airtight. Brandon's world was officially crumbling, and for the first time in his life, there was no one left to bail him out. Then, a few days later, he showed up at my office. Brandon stormed into my office unannounced. He looked like a shell of the man he used to be, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, and visibly shaking. My assistant tried to stop him, but he barged right past her, slamming my door shut behind him. "Jake," he hissed, his voice barely steady. "You need to fix this. Now." I leaned back in my chair, completely unfazed. "Fix what, Brandon? The mess you made? Sorry, not my problem." "You don't get it," he snapped, slamming his hands on my desk. "Those investors are suing me for millions. I don't have that kind of money, and you know it." I stared at him for a moment, letting the silence stretch. "Maybe you should have thought of that before you lied to everyone and stole from your own company," I said calmly. "Actions have consequences, Brandon. You think this is funny?" he growled. "You're my brother, Jake. Family doesn't do this to each other." That word, family, made me laugh out loud. "Family? Like when you stabbed me in the back and got me fired? You're only here because you're out of options. Admit it." He didn't deny it. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his face twisted with anger and desperation. "Get out of my office, Brandon," I said, my voice cold. "We're done here." For a second, I thought he might actually take a swing at me, but instead, he turned and stormed out. And as I watched him leave, I realized I wasn't done yet. Not until he truly hit rock bottom. After Brandon's dramatic visit to my office, I thought he might back off for a while, but I should have known better. He was desperate, and desperate people make stupid moves. A few days later, I got a call from a mutual acquaintance, someone who used to work under me before Brandon took over. "Hey Jake," they said, sounding hesitant. You might want to know. Brandon's been telling people you set him up. He's saying you planted the evidence about the embezzlement. I wasn't surprised. That was typical Brandon, trying to shift the blame when he was backed into a corner. But this time, I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I had one final card to play, and it was time to use it. You see, when Brandon took over as CEO, he'd made a critical mistake. He'd kept all his shady financial dealings tied to one specific account. And guess whose name was also tied to that account? His ex-wife, Melissa. Melissa and Brandon had split a few years earlier, and let's just say it wasn't an amicable divorce. She hated his guts, but she also hated being dragged into his mess even more. So, when I reached out to her, she was more than willing to help. I asked her to verify some of the financial records I'd found, particularly ones showing Brandon had funneled money into personal expenses while still married to her. And she didn't just confirm them, she gave me even more dirt. Turns out, Brandon had been lying to her too, hiding assets during the divorce to avoid paying her a fair settlement. Melissa had been waiting for a chance to get back at him, and I'd just handed her the perfect opportunity. With her testimony and the mountain of evidence I'd collected, I handed everything over to the investor's legal team. The case against Brandon went from strong to bulletproof. A week later, I got an update. The court had frozen all of Brandon's remaining assets. His bank accounts, his cars, even the house he was living in. It was all locked down pending the outcome of the lawsuit. Brandon was officially broke. And yet I knew he still wouldn't give up without a fight. The question was, how much lower could he sink? After Brandon's assets were frozen, I thought he might finally retreat, but I should have known he had one last desperate play up his sleeve. One morning I got a call from my mom. "Jake, what's going on with your brother?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "He called me last night, crying. Said you're ruining his life?" I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Mom, Brandon did this to himself. He lied, cheated, and burned every bridge he had. I'm just making sure he faces the consequences. But he's your brother," she said softly. "Can't you just let it go? Help him get back on his feet." It was classic Brandon, using Mom to guilt-trip me. I explained everything, how he got me fired, stole my job, and tried to smear my name. She listened quietly, but I could tell she was conflicted. "I just don't want to see you two tearing each other apart," she finally said. I didn't have the heart to tell her how far things had already gone. Later that day, Brandon tried calling me again. I ignored it. Then came the texts. At first, they were the usual, begging for help, claiming he'd change, but when I didn't respond, they turned nasty. "You think you're better than me? You're nothing without me, Jake. This isn't over. You'll see." I brushed it off, but part of me wondered what he was planning. A few days later, I found out. I got an email from my head of HR. Apparently, someone had anonymously emailed my company, claiming I'd engaged in unethical business practices. The accusations were vague, stuff about stealing clients and insider trading, but it was clearly Brandon's handiwork. The timing couldn't have been worse. I was in the middle of negotiating a massive deal with a new client, and the last thing I needed was a scandal, even a fake one. But instead of panicking, I decided to use this to my advantage. I called a meeting with my legal team and PR staff, and we crafted a carefully worded public statement. In it, I not only denied the accusations but also revealed the ongoing lawsuit against Brandon, complete with receipts showing his history of unethical behavior. The statement went live that same day, and within hours, the tide turned completely. The new client I was negotiating with? They called me personally to assure me they were still on board. As for Brandon? His little stunt backfired spectacularly. The media pounced on the story, painting him as a bitter, desperate man trying to take down his more successful brother. And for the first time, I realized something. Brandon wasn't just losing his reputation or his money. He was losing his grip on reality. After Brandon's failed attempt to smear me, things went quiet, for a while. No calls, no emails, no cryptic social media posts. Part of me thought he'd finally given up, but deep down, I knew better. Brandon wasn't the type to just fade away. I was right. A few weeks later, I got a call from Melissa, his ex-wife. "Jake," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. "You're not going to believe this, but Brandon's been trying to dig up dirt on you. He called me yesterday, asking if I'd help expose you." I wasn't surprised. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to go to hell," she said bluntly. "But you should know, He's desperate, Jake. He mentioned something about showing up at your company. That was all I needed to hear. I immediately told my security team to be on high alert. Sure enough, 2 days later, Brandon showed up at my office, causing a scene in the lobby. He looked completely unhinged. His suit was wrinkled, his hair a mess, and he was shouting at the receptionist about how he demanded to see me. "Let him up," I said over the intercom. "But make sure security stays close." When he walked into my office, I barely recognized him. This wasn't the smooth-talking, overconfident brother I grew up with. This was a man on the verge of losing everything, if he hadn't already. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat, slamming his fists on my desk. I stayed calm. "Brandon, what are you even doing here? You're embarrassing yourself." "Embarrassing myself?" he barked, laughing bitterly. "You ruined my life, Jake. You took everything from me." I leaned back in my chair. "Funny. That's exactly how I felt when you stabbed me in the back and got me fired. Remember that?" He stared at me, his face twisting with anger. "You don't understand. I was trying to make something of myself. You always had everything handed to you, Mom and Dad's attention, the best opportunities. I had to fight for scraps." I shook my head. "No, Brandon. You didn't fight for scraps. You lied, cheated, and stole from me, and from everyone else who trusted you. That's why you're here right now, not because of me." For a moment, he looked like he was going to argue. But then his shoulders slumped, and the fight drained out of him. "What do you want from me, Jake?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. I stared at him, considering my answer carefully. "What I want," I said slowly, "is for you to finally own up to what you've done. No more excuses, no more blaming me or anyone else. Just take responsibility, for once in your life." He didn't respond. He just stood there, silent, before finally turning and walking out of my office without another word. I thought that might be the end of it. But Brandon wasn't finished yet. Not even close. I thought Brandon's silent exit meant he'd finally accepted reality. I was wrong. A week later, my assistant rushed into my office with a panicked look. "Jake, we've got a problem," she said, holding up her tablet. There it was, a viral post on a shady gossip site accusing me of sabotaging Brandon's career and ruining his life. The post included photos of me at the charity event, emails Brandon had clearly fabricated, and a sob story about how I'd always been jealous of him. It was pathetic, but it was gaining traction. I stayed calm. "Get legal on this," I told her. "We're shutting this down today." By the afternoon, the post was removed, but I knew this was Brandon's last-ditch attempt to pull me down with him. The next day, I got a call from him. "You think you've won?" he snarled. "This isn't over, Jake." But his voice cracked as he said it, and I realized something. Brandon wasn't just desperate, he was broken. After Brandon's failed smear attempt, I decided to pay him one final visit. Not to gloat, but to lay everything out once and for all. I found him at a rundown motel just outside the city. The guy who used to strut around in tailored suits was now sitting on the edge of a creaky bed, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt that had definitely seen better days. Empty beer bottles were scattered everywhere. When he saw me, he didn't even get up. "Here to rub salt in the wound, Jake?" he muttered. "No," I said, stepping inside. "I'm here because I think you need to hear the truth, whether you like it or not." He didn't respond, so I kept going. "You did this to yourself, Brandon. You lied to everyone, betrayed the people who trusted you, and now you're sitting here, blaming me for your choices. When are you going to stop playing the victim and take responsibility?" For a long moment, he just stared at the floor. Then, finally, he said, "I thought I could fix it. I thought I could make it all work. And look where that got you." I said, "You've got nothing left, Brandon. No job, no money, no reputation. This is your rock bottom. What you do next? That's on you." I turned to leave, but before I walked out the door, I added, "If you ever figure out how to stop blaming everyone else, maybe we'll talk. Until then, we're done." As I left, I couldn't tell if he'd heard me or not. But for the first time, I didn't care. Months passed, and I didn't hear from Brandon again. Part of me wondered if he'd finally taken my words to heart, but I wasn't holding my breath. I was too busy focusing on my business and enjoying the life I'd built for myself, without him. Then, one day, I got an unexpected email. It was from Brandon. The subject line read, "I owe you an apology." Curious, I opened it. The message was short, but for the first time in years, it felt genuine. "Shake. You were right. I messed up more than I ever realized. I've spent my whole life blaming other people for my failures, but the truth is, I only have myself to blame. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect us to go back to being brothers. I just wanted you to know that I'm finally owning up to everything. Take care. Brandon." I stared at the screen for a long time, not sure how to feel. It wasn't the apology I'd been waiting for, but it was something. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the email to my mom with a simple note. "Thought you'd want to see this." In the end, I realized Brandon's downfall wasn't my victory, it was his lesson. And maybe, just maybe, he'd finally learned it.